In late June of 1984, the Cubs appeared to be in the midst of their June swoon fans become accustomed to, and they looked to be taking a loss to the biggest rivals on national TV. But then, Ryne Sandberg happened, and he tied the game twice over the 9th and 10th. The reason this became known as the Ryne Sandberg game. So let's look at that game and why it was so important for the Cubs.
Totally sports-esque. Major League.
In the decades before the 1984 season, the Cubs really lived up to their bittersweet nickname of the lovable losers. After they won the pennant in 1945, losing the World Series and having a curse placed on them by some guy with a goat, they were over 500 in 1946, but had just one season over 500 over the next 20. And that season over 500 was in 1969, when they blew a 9.5 game lead at the end of August. They had a few more competitive seasons over the 70s, but they never made the playoffs, often running into what they called the June swoon, in part blamed by the numerous day games they played, as they were the only team without lights. And after selling the team to the Chicago Tribune, ownership turned to Dallas Green, first off helping the Phillies win their first World Series title in 1980. In 81, he was hired as the general manager, and he wasted no time reshaping the Cubs from top to bottom. One of his first and most important moves was a trade with his old team in Philadelphia. The Cubs would trade Ivan de Jesus for veteran shortstop Larry Bowa, but the key piece, though almost overlooked at the time, was a young minor league third baseman named Ryne Sandberg, and it would prove to be a lopsided trade. But by 1983, the Cubs are still struggling, finishing 71-91 under manager Lee Elliott, who would be fired before the season ended, and Green would respond with sweeping changes. He hired Jim Fay to manage and added Don Zimmer to coach third base, and filled out a new staff that gave the team a fresh direction, and the roster overhaul was even more dramatic. In December of 1983, the Cubs landed pitcher Scott Sanderson in a 3-team deal, also adding veteran pinch hitter Richie Hebner, and just before the 84 season began, they acquired outfielders Gary Matthews and Bob Denier from the Phillies. Denier's speed and Matthews' bat would become essential, as they also brought in reliever Tim Sutter. And the biggest splash came on June 15, 1984. With injuries hitting the rotation, Green traded young prospects, including future star Joe Carter, to the Cleveland Indians for catcher Ron Hassey and pitcher Rick Sutcliffe. He was just 4-5 with a 5.15 ERA, but everything changed once he became a Cub. He went 16-1 the rest of the season with a 2.69 ERA in 150 innings, as he captured the Cy Young and anchored a revitalized rotation that also featured Sanderson, Dennis Eckersley, and Steve Trout. And by the summer, the Cubs had one of the best starting lineups in the game. Bob Denier set the table in center field, Ryne Sandberg was now the everyday second baseman, and he would emerge as the Gold Glove defender, and he would make the All-Star team for the first time. And behind the daily double of Denier and Sandberg was a ton of power: Gary Matthews, Leon Durham, Ron Cey, Keith Moreland, and Jody Davis. And at the back end of games, the Cubs turned to closer Lee Smith, one of the most intimidating pitchers in the game. And simply put, the team felt different. It had speed, power, defense, pitching depth, and a type of fire that wasn't there in the past in Chicago. They started 12-8 in April, and they led the NL East race for 2 months. But reality seemed to be setting back in. By late June, they had dropped 10 of their last 16 games, including a brutal 4-game sweep in Philadelphia. They slipped into third place, and the old familiar doubts crept back into Wrigley Field. But things would change on June 23rd. In front of a national television audience, a big deal at the time, the baseball world would finally take notice. 38,000 fans packed into Wrigley for the Saturday afternoon game of the week on NBC. Now on the other side was their bitter rivals in the St. Louis Cardinals. 2 years passed since their most recent World Series, and the two rivals had gone in different directions over the previous decades. Steve Rainbow Trout would start for Chicago, while St. Louis would counter with rookie Raul Citarella, making his first big league start, while Bob Costas and Tony Kubek had the call for a national audience. And the game would start ugly for the Cubs. Trout was shelled, and by the 6th inning, the Cubs trailed 9-3. Another loss looked inevitable, but then the bats woke up. The Cubs scored 5 runs at the bottom of the 6th, drawing within just 1 run, and suddenly what looked to be a blowout was now going to be a thriller. By the 9th inning, the Cubs still trailed by 1, and waiting for them on the mound was a familiar face in Bruce Sutter, the future Hall of Famer and the former Cub who had won a Cy Young Award in Chicago. He was now a part of the enemy team, and he continued to be one of the game's most dominant closers, and he had been untouchable since he entered the game in the 7th inning. But leading off for Chicago was their 24-year-old second baseman Ryne Sandberg. Already with 3 hits on the day, Sandberg worked the count to 1-1, and then he would crush a hanging curveball deep into the left center bleachers, all the way to Waveland Avenue, as Wrigley Field would erupt, as the Cubs had tied the game. But the drama was just beginning. The game went to extras, and in the top of the 10th, the Cardinals struck back with 2 runs, highlighted by Ozzie Smith stealing second then scoring from second on a Willie McGee double, and that had given McGee the cycle, a fact that would soon be mostly forgotten. But not at the time, as right after, NBC named McGee the player of the game. But that didn't really age well. Sutter was still out there for the 10th, and he got 2 quick outs, which seemed to end their hopes. But then, Denier would walk, and Sandberg came up again. And with the same pitcher, the same stakes, and the same count, on the 1-1 pitch, Sandberg swung, and he hit another deep drive to left, and another no-doubt home run, causing Wrigley Field to explode in chaos. And for nearly a full minute, NBC's broadcast team let the pictures tell the story, while Harry Carey, someone who began his career with the Cardinals, would lose his mind in the booth. Things went to the 11th, where the Cardinals did not score in the top half, but in the bottom half, the Cubs would load the bases on 3 walks, 2 of which were intentional, caused by Leon Durham stealing second, and a throwing error by Darryl Porter. And then Dave Owen, an infielder who didn't play much, would single home the winning run, as Harry Carey yelled out familiar lines in the booth.
Cubs win! Cubs win!
It was just a regular season game in June, but it felt like so much more. For the Cubs, it was the spark that carried them to a division title, that coming on September 24th, at 3 River Stadium in Pittsburgh, in front of just over 5,000 fans, their mid-season pickup in Rick Sutcliffe would throw a 2-hit complete game, that being his 14th consecutive win. The Cubs would advance to NLCS to face the San Diego Padres, winners of the West, and led by stars like Tony Gwynn, Steve Garvey, and Goose Gossage. In Wrigley Field's first 2 playoff games since 1945, in Game 1, they won 13-0. Then they won 4-2 the next night. With a 2-0 lead, the Cubs needed just one more win in San Diego to reach the World Series again. But history had other plans. The Padres took Game 3 7-1, but then the heartbreak would start in Game 4. With the score tied 5-5 in the bottom of the 9th, Cubs closer Lee Smith gave up a walk-off home run to Steve Garvey. But that was just the start. In Game 5, behind Sutcliffe, the Cubs held a 3-0 lead in the 6th inning, and they still led 3-2 in the 7th. But then, disaster struck. A sharp ground ball slipped under the glove of first baseman Leon Durham, a moment reminiscent of Bill Buckner before that was a thing. And Buckner was actually traded from the Cubs to the Red Sox that same year. It was a critical error blamed on Gatorade reportedly spilling on Durham's glove, and it opened the door for San Diego. The Padres then erupted for 4 runs, and they won the game 6-3, making Cubs fans believe in a curse maybe more than ever before, as the dream of a World Series meeting with the Detroit Tigers, who they played in their most recent matchup and beat in their most recent wins, was now gone. But 1984 was still a season of transformation. For Ryne Sandberg, it was his breakthrough. He led the National League in runs and triples and nearly joined the exclusive 20-20-20-20 club with doubles, triples, home runs, and stolen bases, as he would win MVP, the first Cub to do so since Ernie Banks a quarter century earlier. And though the Cubs continued to fall short in heartbreaking ways over the next few decades, the heartbreaks were at least different stemming from the season, at least ending in October in some seasons, instead of the midseason slumps they were used to. And it all really stems from that June game that became known as the Ryne Sandberg game, a combination of a perfect storm, a nationally televised game against their biggest rival, and a back-and-forth game with multiple comebacks, with Ryne Sandberg being the catalyst, homering off a former Cub great twice in the same situation. This propelled a new era of Cubs baseball that did include lights, and propelled Ryne Sandberg to a Hall of Fame career, a rare instance where a game was named after a single player, such as the Bucky Dent game, or the Rick Camp game, or the Chris Davis game. And for Cubs fans, it became a moment that would rival one that came 32 years later. Sandberg later said, "Fans come up to me all the time and they want to talk about that game. They tell me where they were. They were either driving in a car listening to the game, or they were at the game, or they were watching it on TV. They were calling their relatives, saying you've got to turn this game on." And though the season ended in crushing fashion, it marked a turning point that changed things for a generation that can be traced back to the Ryne Sandberg game.